Welcome, everybody. My name is Celine Figueroa, and I am from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We have an amazing program in store for you all tonight. Today's program will have a series of short videos and the live Q&A, so please stay tuned. On behalf of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, I am pleased to partner with the International Institute of Indigenous Resource Management and the Denver American Indian Commission to present Indigenous film. As you watch tonight's program, there's a few housekeeping things that we want to go over. That chat is going to be the way that we're going to be able to communicate with you. If you have questions as you're watching the films or as other questions come up during the discussion, go ahead and type them in that chat. You might not be able to see each other's chat, but we can see them on our end, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. We'll be watching that throughout the entire program. The other fun thing is that you'll notice that you have a little notification, or you should have a little notification that says that live closed captioning or live transcription is available. You have the control over whether or not you would like that. You just go ahead and click it, and it's doing its best to capture what we're saying as we are saying it. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Donna to turn on her camera to begin tonight's event. I'd like to introduce Donna Criston, Commissioner of the Denver American Indian Commission. Donna, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Celine. Ha matakiapi, Donna Criston, machiapi, sto, iuha chante, washta nape, chiusapi. Hi, everyone. My name is Donna Criston, and what I said in Lakota language was, I greet you with a warm heart. So, so happy to have everyone here. I am a commissioner with the Denver American Indian Commission. I was former co-chair. So we do this partnership with Denver Museum of Nature and Science and with the Indigenous Environmental Network, or I'm sorry, Resource Management with Merv and Jean. So this is great. And I don't know exactly how long the partnership's been going on, but the Denver American Indian Commission has been in place for close to 13 years or close to 14 years here in the Denver metro area. So we are appointed by the mayor to serve our community here. And yeah, so I pass it to Jean.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm Jean Rubin. I direct the Indigenous Film and Arts Festival, which is a presentation of the International Institute for Indigenous Resource Management. With me is Merv Tano, our Institute president. Merv is also a commissioner on the Denver American Indian Commission. We've lost track, Donna, of how many years it's been, but it's been many, many years. Want to welcome you all to our evening with Terry Jones. We're pleased to have Terry with us tonight. For starters, I want to thank our sponsors. We have a series sponsor that helps bring our monthly Indigenous film series to you throughout the year, Mile High Behavioral Healthcare. So our thanks to them. And our media sponsor is Kuvo Jazz Radio. So many thanks. And our special co-sponsor for tonight's program is TornJersey Media, which is Terry Jones's film production company. I am going to pass the mic to Penny Kelsey. She is a scholar of Seneca descent. She has known Terry for many years. She knows his work, and we think she is the perfect person to introduce Terry to all of you. So, Penny, the mic is yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm here to introduce Terry Jones. Yeah, I'm just thrilled about this. Terry is Seneca Indian Wolf Clan, and he's from Cattaraugus Reservation with his roots, family roots from Buffalo Creek. And he's been making films since 2001. He has made and released over 10 films, from documentary to science fiction to experimental. So he's really versatile in really impressive ways, but he has a much larger body of work of films that are still kind of emerging. The work is emerging. So we can look forward to lots of amazing things coming yet, of course. Terry studied film at Syracuse University, where he was both a Udall scholar and a Haudenosaunee Promise scholar. Terry's films have been screened at festivals internationally, from the UK to New Zealand to Argentina and elsewhere, and they have won multiple awards, and he has served as a panelist and official film selector in many of these film festivals. I first met him in 2011 at a screening of What in the Heck is Corn Soup, which was just an amazing experience. And I found his work so compelling, his body of work so compelling, that of course I had multiple libraries, I think, buy his films at the University of Colorado and elsewhere. And I've taught his films, and this led me to invite Terry to speak in my classes and discuss his vision as a filmmaker. And I have to say, his films have been instrumental in teaching Native American and Indigenous studies for me and for my students for a host of reasons that I think will become clear. Terry's work speaks to the specific responsibilities incumbent upon Black, Indigenous, people of color filmmakers, and it registers at a global level with many audiences. Aesthetically speaking, Terry's work reflects both documentary and Indigenous aesthetic elements, and his narration is pivotal to his work, whether it's verbal, visual, or otherwise. Terry's films sometimes engages the pause to ask us to think and reflect further, leading us to uncover what lies beneath this kind of layered work. So it's this very kind of intentional and thoughtful process that inspires us. Formally speaking, Terry's work also employs key elements of Haudenosaunee condolence to enact the release and healing from grief, an aspect of his work that I've written about. Finally, Terry's partnership with Govan DC, they refer to themselves as the Two Indians, is a signal marker of the global vision of Terry's work and a unique feature of his work that deserves further attention and discussion from us. I am honored and humbled to have been invited to introduce Terry at tonight's event, and I very much look forward to the screening and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. Terry, I'd like to introduce you to our audience and ask you just to say a few words before we jump into the films.
Yeah, Nyaway Scano, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. As Penny had mentioned, all 5 of these films were created while I was studying film at the College of Visual and Performing Arts at Syracuse University. And actually, they're all officially distributed through the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center in Toronto, Canada. So I think there's 5 pieces. They're about 25 minutes long, and then we can do a live discussion and Q&A afterwards. So welcome.
Great. So let's roll the films, and we'll be back in 25 minutes for some discussion with Terry. So Terry, thank you so much for sharing those films with us. I really appreciate that. I would like to start the discussion by asking if you could tell our audience how you got interested in film and kind of what the path was that got you to where you are today.
Thanks, Jean. Wow, 25 minutes went by fast. Nothing seemed to drag on my end. Now that I look at it through, there's been times between when I first made them and then when I see them again. Anyway, I was fortunate enough that the Seneca Nation had started summer enrichment programs when I was a teenager. And one of the first things that they had was a photojournalism class. And we spent a summer in a black and white dark room. We went around and interviewed people about lacrosse games and what was happening in the community. And we took photographs, and we made this publication called the Reservation Times. And it was around that time when I realized how powerful the image was, that you could actually capture a moment in time forever. Unlike now with Photoshop, you can totally, it becomes fluid. So that concept was kind of out the window now. But the following summer, they had a video class, And there we wrote skits and we performed them and learned how to use a video camera. But it was there when I sort of realized that I liked the moving image. But at that point in time, you know, Hollywood or anything like that only came through our televisions. And so I really didn't have any famous or well-known Indigenous filmmakers to try to copy, to say, oh, I want to be like them. So I always felt like that wasn't for me. Long story short, so when I used to live in New York City, and I worked for an investment bank, and I was there on 9/11, and when the towers fell, I lost my job, and I ended up getting some therapy, and my therapist said, either people who go through traumatic events either go through depression or they go through this thing called post-traumatic growth. And it was about 2 months after 9/11, I borrowed a friend's camera, and I filmed my first film called What in the Heck is Corn Soup? It's a documentary, but it's just me showing the process of making a boiling Iroquois white corn, wood ash, and kidney beans and salt pork. And that was how I got started. And then in 2011, Penny Kelsey invited me over to CU Boulder to screen my film, What in the Heck is Corn Soup? And as I was walking across the quad, I kind of got this idea where I'm like, I really enjoy sharing films, and or I wanted to be a professor in film. But up to that point in time in my life, I had not graduated from college. So right after I was done with that trip, I applied to Syracuse University, got into their film program, went in as a extremely non-traditional student with 50 other fresh out of high school film majors, and I just took advantage of every opportunity I had. I studied a semester in Florence, Italy. I studied another semester in Bologna. I studied at the FAMU Film School doing 35mm film in the Czech Republic. Did a summer in Los Angeles, and then graduated in 2016. It was after I graduated was when I started to started to see if there was any hope of finding an audience for these class assignments. The films that we saw tonight were more or less class assignments. They weren't with the idea that, wow, I'm going to submit these to festivals and hope maybe they'll win an award. That wasn't it. I was just doing it as a class assignment. So since that time of graduating, I've sort of had this big learning curve on how film festivals work, what you need to do to submit, and then once you get accepted, what's your media press kit, giving them the right dimensions, giving them the right blurbs, the right movie posters. So it's been a really great learning experience for me. And then you throw in social media, and you got the Instagram and the Facebook, and letting everybody know how they can see my films. So I feel like my journey has just started as being a filmmaker. As I said, I look at these now with different eyes because I made them a couple years ago. I'm looking forward to hopefully next year in the fall of 2022. I'm going to go to grad school. I'm going to apply to a school in Toronto to continue and grow from being a filmmaker.
Great. Keep submitting them. We want to see more.
Thanks.
Let me give you the
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Terry. Appreciate the films. Love them. The Soup for My Brother, for me, is it's a powerful film because it, in a very subtle yet powerful way, displays the connection between Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, and a place. That how the place not only kind of provokes memory, but also the kind of embodied, ritualistic, if you will, preparation of the soup is part of that memory as well. Can you kind of tell us a bit more about that kind of that nexus between filmmaking, who you are, and these places.
Mhm. Yeah, so yeah, place is definitely important when I come up with these ideas for stories, because when you think about it, when we interact with each other one-on-one, we engage our five senses. But when you think about the moving image, you're only really engaging sight and sound. So as a filmmaker, what I'm trying to do is to fill in as much with that sight and sound to get the viewer to be in that place, to occupy that space, to identify with the character. And what's powerful about storytelling is what I'd like to think, or what I strive to do, is to tell stories that are relatable, universal, identifiable, whose story and characters who just tend to be Native American. I'm not trying to, how do I say, I guess it comes with trying to be authentic or having authenticity to it. So when I made Soup for My Brother, it originally was a documentary class with my professor, Mizo Suki, he was from Slovakia. And our class assignment was process. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna do this process. We're gonna show every fall we roast Iroquois white corn. And it's another short film called Ashes to Ashes. So we follow this journey with my dad. He gets in the car, he gets the white corn. Then he stops at Danny's house, his brother, and he gets the firewood. And there he says, well, I'm gonna roast Iroquois white corn, and when I make my first bowl of corn soup, I'm gonna come up here and I'm gonna have a bowl for my brother. And so then we come to my house here, and he builds a fire and he roasts it, and that was that. So then when I presented it to my professor, he was like, the process is interesting, but there's this thing between your father and his brother. You should explore that. And so, the end of the semester was coming up, and so you really can only use what you have available to you. So I'm like, Dad, why don't we just go up to Uncle Danny's house, and why don't we see what's there? This was more of a collaboration with my father and his memories. I'm just the conduit who helped tell the story, but it's very powerful to be able to to traverse through these spaces, literal spaces that were in his memory. And there was a house there, a family homestead, where I lived my first 5 years of my life. And it's just for us, I think maybe that came across in the film, is our identification with that place. And it's also the history that he shares is a time that preceded me. So I was also interested in sharing that as well. But I would like to think that what people identify with it, as I said, a universal story, but the place always it feels mystical or magical to me.
What I thought was fascinating, because I could feel the heat from that wood fire in that Weber kettle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet he had the extension cord.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that that kind of modernity and a more ancient way was I don't know, it was something that stuck in my head.
Yeah, that's because that was a documentary class, and what I found was interesting about it is that documentary, in some ways, if it's not cinema verite, then it's constructed almost like a narrative. So I'd like to think that I did a good job in terms of the story, the character, the production, and then the editing, because there's takes I could show where I'm like, all right, Dad, action. He picks up the knife and he starts to cut the food, and then I'm like, okay, we got to get a close-up shot. So in that aspect, it's documentary in every aspect of the story and the process and what he's doing, but in some ways it's narrative, because I just didn't pick up the camera and just shoot him what he was doing. And he also had a little bit of ambivalence to talking on camera. So it wasn't until during the process I'm like, well, why don't you do what you do? We'll work on the narration together, and then I'll put them in. And it's sort of like I was learning as I was going along, but at the same time, because it's so well received and people identify with it, it's sort of like writing a hit song. I know there's magic in there, but and that's sort of like pressure that I have on myself. I'm like, wow, how do I recreate that magic that we made with Soup for My Brother? And I'm gonna do my best to try not to try to repeat success.
That leads me to the next question I had for you. And there's somebody in the chat had something that also kind of segues in. So I'm going to combine these questions. We have someone saying, I really enjoy the non-mainstream style of these documentary shorts. Any words on it and the reasoning behind? And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about your process, because one of the things I find so engaging about your films is you have a powerful story, but you have such an interesting way to present it. Nothing is just a straightforward narrated documentary. So could you talk a little bit about your creative process of, the story on the one hand and the technique of conveying that to an audience?
Yeah, the non-glossy parts of my films is more had to do with what was available to me. Like Untitled and Unlabeled. That was a class assignment I did over a weekend. I literally put that together in like 6 or 7 hours. Same with Ode to the Nine. In some ways, I'm not embarrassed by them, but I was like, I only made the films with what I had. With Soup for My Brother, it's just me and my dad and a camera and some sound. But then when it played at Imaginative in Toronto, it played in the international short section with all these short films that had 40 or 50 like credits of sound design and foundations to help fund them. And yet the response we got afterwards, people are like, can I hug your dad? And I'm like, well, you have to ask my mom if you can do that. But in terms of the process, yeah, storytelling is universal. I'm not for these short films were experimental, and it's not so much to say, and it's funny too when I talk about it in terms of coming from film school, because sometimes these films could be considered video art, and sometimes it kind of feels like films here and video art is a little bit below it, and for me it's as I was learning about film, it's like, well, how do in order to break the rules, you have to learn them. And so with my eye blinks with Geek Squad, I read Walter Murch's, an excerpt from Walter Murch's book on how we naturally edit with our own eye blinks. So I said, well, let me try that with this story I want to tell. So it's sort of like a tissue box for me in terms of stories and things that I want to, it's almost therapeutic in a way, because I'm like, I want people to know why I don't have an Indian name. But how do I tell it? How do I go about it? And it's sort of like being in film school and then being under pressure to complete these projects in a timely manner. You just sort of like, I'll just use eye blinks and see what happens there. So like I mentioned before, even with Soup for My Brother, a lot of it is a learning process. I'm doing by learning. But what I'm finding, what I would love to do is go to grad school, but then hopefully my next future projects will have funding. I always make this joke, is like, what does being an independent Indigenous filmmaker mean? And I'm like, well, it kind of means being unfunded, because there aren't a lot of places here in the States. There's not a lot of emphasis on funding for the arts, and I'm really appreciative of Canada. They've really come to embrace my work, and especially the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center, that that they find value. But it's sort of like I'm the stepchild that's looking in at all the desserts, or not the stepchild, I don't know what analogy I'm making, but it's just sort of like looking at all the opportunities that a country like Canada that funds the arts, and compared to what we don't have here. And it's just sort of like, oh, if I only had more funding and more access to the proper equipment, I think I wouldn't want I don't want my films to be glossy. I wouldn't want that gloss to it. I kind of like the realness and authenticity to it. And one of the things they taught us in film school was that as long as the sound is good and the story is engaging and the characters are good, the audience will forgive sometimes the image if it's not perfect. And you know, as I watch these films, I'm like, it's soup for my brother. I'm like, oh, I'm cutting my dad's head off up to here, and there's one shot I can see the camera shadow on his shirt, but nobody else sees it. I see it, but
no one else sees it. I'll tell you that the image that I love from that film is when you're shooting your father through the windshield of the tractor, and you've got the reflection of the trees and the clouds, and it's just, that's beautiful.
yeah, there was almost on every project that I've done, there's been this like happy accident that happens. And when we were filming that, and I'm like, Dad, we got 4 hours, you know, and it was cold, and it was in the beginning of November. We probably should have had snow by then. And when I remember that shot, particularly putting the camera on the tripod on that, by that windshield, and have him looking out, and I'm like, there's something magical going on here. I hope it means something good. And there was another one that we did, Govan and I did, with Give and Take. And in the end, when the trickster disappears, the back of the hills in Syracuse, the sun came out and lit them, like they almost looked like they were on fire. And when we presented that in portfolio review, everybody's like, how did you guys do that? How did you? And we were just like, movie magic. So.
We had two questions about Geek Squad. One was somebody wanted to know when would your grandmother have given you your name?
Yeah.
She was looking for you. And the other, somebody wanted to know, is Geek Squad a name that you actually use, or was this just for the film?
It was just for the film. It was so I mentioned it in the chat, but it might not come across in my narration. I said my grandmother kept my name for me, and it might sound like my grandmother kept my name from me. So, but as I said, the names are given to us when we're newborns. So she just had them written down and had them, and I would only really use them if I needed it for ceremonies. Unlike today, everybody is pretty much using their Indian name and not their American name. What was the other part of that question? I forgot the other part of that question.
Oh, that was it. When would she have given you?
Oh yeah, so yeah, it would have been any time. It wasn't like it was in a cookie jar and she was waiting to give it to me at some certain point. It's just that I had never needed it, or I had never had used it. So, but I also want to mention, I saw earlier in the comments that somebody had mentioned about Empire State, and yeah, Empire State and what it actually kind of means. When Govan and I put that together, we wanted the subtitle for it is it's Empire State, but it's Invasion, War, and Occupation, and that's more or less told through this Native American character. What we wanted to more or less, what it says is that is not just Indigenous people, but any kind of marginalized people in the world. One, we have the television, where it kind of goes one direction. So the outside world enters into your space through this television. But I mentioned that that like Indigenous people as well, that we may not be in positions of power. We may not be able to make like policy decisions on certain things. So with Empire State, what we are more or less saying is like, we see you. We see patterns. We can see things that, especially when it comes to sort of things like that with colonization and invasion and war. It's like it's more or less for us. It was more like an idea that giving a voice to the common man. That these big world decisions are made, but that's usually the common people are the ones that suffer. And it's that we made that in 2013. It's 8 years old, and I still can't believe how relevant it seems today. It almost to me seems like a political film, but it wasn't necessarily meant to be that way. It was just sort of with a lot of my works, it's just sort of like I either put a spin on the thing at the end, or I leave it unopen, or like an open-ended conclusion where I leave it up to the viewer to decide what happens to these characters or what happens next.
One of the things that caught my attention in that film is your father, he's cleaning the ramps. And that's what I would call them. I don't
Mhm.
know. And I've seen that in other films that you've made.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah, I usually include, they make a joke, some people make a joke for me, they're like, all right, where's the corn? There's going to be corn in your video or your film somewhere along the way. And the one thing that I didn't notice, you guys might not have picked up on it. I showed Empire State to a friend of mine, and she goes, wait, those wild onions wouldn't be wild in September. Those are a spring vegetable. And I was like, oh my God. I'm like, wow, that's true. I'm like, but he could have got the wild onions from the store, but that wasn't the idea. The idea was that he was doing Indian things, while he's watching these events, unfold through his TV. And that whole thing too is about reflection. That's sort of what film language is kind of about. It's not just literally, well, he's not saying anything, but as he's looking out the window and he's reflecting, and the TV is reflecting on his face, it's reflecting on his boots, the outdoors is reflecting on the frame. All that stuff can be subtle. And and the same with film language in terms of like Geek Squad, unless maybe you wouldn't know that I'm changing the image with my eye blinks unless I told you. But there's something about it that might be engaging to you that Walter Murch had said we do that naturally. It's just something that people might or might not pick up on.
so someone asked, they're curious about your freezer archive.
Mm-hmm.
And asks, have you preserved digital records of archives from your other family members? How did you gather them? Also, why are they frozen? And then how has your Google expanded or contracted since you made that film?
Yeah, that's when that Ode to the Nine screened at Imaginative, the first thing I told the audience was like, do not put your hard drives in the freezer. It was just more of a metaphor for like preserving. But I'm sorry, what was the second part of that question?
It was about collecting the material. Is it is it an archive of family members? And
yeah, I do. I have so many drives. I probably have about 20 hard drives and backups of those hard drives. I don't know what I'm going to do with these zeros and ones. I don't know how I'm going to pass them on or how I preserve them or what technology will be like in 10 or 15 years. But yeah, anytime I see something, a picture, even on Facebook, social media that family will post, I'll grab it and document it the best way that I can. It's almost, yeah, I do literally have my own Google, my own Terry, I say Terry bite, you might have saw it. There's a Terry bite that I put in the freezer.
Yeah, it's an interesting question for people who are archiving material. But
I know where I got that from. I got it from my parents. If anybody follows my social media thing, I have these great photographs, but my mom takes those photographs. A lot of she archives all these articles and when certain historical events were going on in our tribe in the 90s, my dad was setting up the VCR and taking newscasts. So, and my brothers played lacrosse, so I have all these lacrosse videos. I have so many. I could do my own like channel and constantly play something and maybe not even repeat anything for days, maybe weeks before I'd have to repeat it again.
A comment, and would like to get your response because that question is one that intrigues me because in a sense you do have an archive and it's filled with images and sounds and speech. But as you say, there's zeros and ones in a particular using a particular technology. Yet if you made them real, they would be memories. But right now they are archives, and that was one of the things that we're trying to deal with museums. because in a sense, they are archives. So how do we make them places of memory? How do we make your metaphoric refrigerator or freezer a place of memory instead of an archive?
Yeah, recently I had took part in the National Film Board of Canada in CFC. They had done a virtual reality lab that I took part in last summer and into the early fall. And part of it for me was using my dad as a character and using his memories. And and I felt a little spoiled in that project because they gave me like 2D and 3D designers and sound and editors and video. And what I ended up doing was creating my father's childhood memory of his house. And so the viewer would be able to walk in and learn about each item that they picked up. It was almost like done like a video game in some ways. So you had to find these objects in order to move to the next room. But along the way, as you're going through down the road, down his memory, you're getting these billboard signs that says, information not only about his own personal life, but about Native Americans or Indigenous people. Like what are our health rates? What is our graduation rates? So the whole idea is at the end, and it is at the end of the project. My father is it's a lockdown. And so you just see my dad sitting in front of the TV, like Empire State, but now he gets up and he goes to the window and he shines the flashlight out the window, and we end up finding out that he can only interact with his grandkids by flashing a light at them and them waving back at him. But in terms of like how you can use those spaces, it's a good idea. I mean, I always feel like sometimes that my ideas and where technology sometimes has to catch up to what I would like them to be. And I'm hoping that at some point these massive hard drives that I have with information on it would be able to use in a way that's user friendly and yet respectful in the way of like, because there's like ceremonial things that I have that I would never even make public there, but they should be accessible to those who need it. So.
Terrific. So we've had some, we've had a few folks just posting some comments, not questions, but just comments of appreciation. We'll make sure you get a transcript of this chat, but we have someone saying, I love the purity, authenticness, the raw beauty of these films. Familial connections come through so strongly and in a pure way, and one can feel those connections. Can't wait to see more and what comes next. Of course, that's what we're all thinking. We want to see what comes next. These very much make one think about more than meets the eye.
There was some funny, it's the idea. So when I went to film school and then we did script writing class, and then they're like, well, it's important what your characters are doing and what they're saying or how they're saying it. But then how they're saying it is the subtext. And I was like, I lived in New York and engaged in the outside world, the corporate world, where you aren't defined by who you are, you're defined by what you do. And then people, this is what's another thing I learned when I was taking acting classes was that, everybody has an objective. And sometimes you don't wear those objectives on your sleeve. You might have some sinister ideas in terms of what your objective is. And so for me, I felt like at that point in my life when I got to film school, I'm like, there is no subtext to me, to myself. What you see is what you get. However I'm coming across for you or however you like me, I'm only reflecting back the good things or the bad things sometimes of what you see in me. And I just think it's really interesting that having to put subtext into projects, when they're not arguing about dinner, they're arguing about who's something else. But I'd like to think that it's that sort of me being my authentic self and putting that into my work, revealing things about myself that are really personal, but I'd like to think I do it in a way that's more identifiable and not necessarily exploitive of myself or to make my audience cringe or to make them uncomfortable. I think with Empire State, like I said, it could be considered a political film, but it's not pointing a finger at history or at a certain group of people and saying, look what you did to us. That's not it. That's not how I am as a filmmaker. For me, it's a matter of how can I present these issues to you in a way that makes you, that my stories or my characters will haunt you afterwards. So that, you know, people are always with Soup for My Brother, like, that story just stayed with me. It just stayed with me. People like to watch it, you know, a few times over because it's just something comforting about it. Even though it's a sad film, I think it's not sad, but it's profound or poetic is sort of what adjectives that are used sometimes to describe my work.
It touches people. You know, there's probably no one in this audience who hasn't lost somebody close to them, and it's such a beautiful, touching statement of the love that goes on even after, you know, after someone has passed. I mean, I think it universally resonates with folks.
Yeah, I've really come to appreciate my father and his willingness to, you know, I make a joke all the time. I'm like, well, when you either don't have access to actors or you're afraid you don't have actors, I'm like, just have your family step in. And it's worked out nicely with my father. And to share a little bit what's coming up in, I'm going to be making a short film, shooting a short film this summer called Osno, which means bark in Seneca. But it really is, it's the narrative story of Soup for My Brother. It's about a 13-year-old Seneca boy who steals his grandfather's butcher knife.
Yeah.
But the whole idea in it is that the grandfather is trying to teach him the traditional ways. But this takes place in the 50s, and the boy is obsessed with World War II. So there's kind of like this conflict going on between them where the boy doesn't really, he's too young to understand especially with what we know now, the dire need to preserve our language, to you know, preserve the lands that we have, to, you know, to protect the environment. And you know, throughout the piece, the grandfather is always like, who's going to remember you? Who's going to remember you? So as so the grandfather confiscates his makeshift airplanes and says, these time wasters that belong out there, and he destroys them. Well, the boy gets mad and takes the knife, goes into the woods, breaks it, stabs it into a tree, and then he comes back and the grandfather's like, so where is it? And the boy doesn't answer. Grandfather goes into his work shed, closes the door. The boy comes along, says, grandfather, I'm ashamed. And he goes, who's going to remember you? He goes, I don't think so. And you see the boy, he's just standing there and he knows he has to do what's right. So in the beginning, he was supposed to collect Indian medicine. He looks down at his satchel. He's like, he's going to do what's right. He runs into the woods and he goes, I'll remember. And then we flash back to today. We see him as a grandfather as well. And he says, I remembered, and he'll be standing right next to that knife in that tree. So that's sort of my idea for my next narrative film, which hopefully will get funded. It won't be, you know, it'll have a little gloss to it, but it won't be, you know, it won't be shot on tape or anything like that. So.
I always find I love to hear filmmakers talk about their next work because that whole storyboard is up there.
Yeah.
Terry, one of the things that we at the Institute are kind of struggling with, and we think we see a role for filmmakers in kind of dealing with this issue. When you look at the world of indigenous, or the worlds of indigenous peoples, the modernity is changing it very, very rapidly, a lot faster than I even thought was possible, because it is exacerbated by the rapid change of climate. And so the places that bring forth memory, because we do things on these places, in these places, with these places, are not the same places now that they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or when your dad was young. Is there a role for filmmakers to preserve those kinds of visions or those kinds of experiences?
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean filmmaker as kind of a salvage archaeologist, but they are stories that are so vulnerable to being lost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, those are the things that I've always, I always look at it like when I was younger, it's like the elders and the older people in the family, they were the knowledge keepers. And then you always felt like, I'm going to live forever. That's not going to be, that's going to be whatever. Well, I'm at a point in my life right now where I'm kind of in the middle. So it's sort of like a relay race. I'm still grabbing the baton from the elders that are still here with knowledge that we need to preserve and we need to keep alive. And at the same time, I'm now passing back some information to the future generations. And it's sort of like, it's daunting because I'm like, when I was growing up, we were told that the end of the world was coming, that there was nothing we could do to stop it, that there will be a certain point in time when we will lose our language. And even since I made Ode to the Nine, I said there were 100 fluent speakers. Now there's maybe 20. And, so sort of like, and when I talk to the speaker of the Longhouse, I try to have these conversations when I'm like, I think human nature is we want hope. If you're telling me that this train is coming towards us, that we're gonna lose our identity and lose our language, then how do I stop it? Or if I can't stop it, how can I slow it down while we try to preserve what we can? Yeah, it's it's really, and in terms of where I fit in as a filmmaker and how do I do my part in that? One of the biggest inhibitors is that elder, knowledge keepers who are older, they don't like recorded devices. They don't like even the moving image, even their sound of their voice. So it's a matter of things like that's what I said with Soup for My Brother. It was a compromise between my father being a character talking on camera and actually just narrating it, because it wasn't as intrusive to them. But yet I hear them say, you got to get our stories out. You got to, remember, you have to help us remember. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's yeah, I don't know what I'm still trying to figure that out for myself in terms of like where my role in that is. Is it in the micro? Is it here on my territory, local? Or is it a bigger picture? Is it using my films in a way that not just Indigenous people, but the world in general? Because there was a point in time when we kept our information to ourselves. We invited the outside world to come into our longhouse, and then we said, but don't record, because those words need to only be said at a certain time. You can't tell the seeds that it's time to grow if you're playing it in the fall. So we're like, so we found out they were recording it and they were in museums or wherever. So we're like, nope, no more. But now we're starting to see how the world is Mother Earth is injured. And so now I think the tide is turning a little bit where maybe we should share our knowledge. And and I think the hard part that I've learned for myself is sometimes being your most vulnerable and being my most authentic self leaves me open to get hurt. But it takes a lot of strength in order to be that way. So I make myself feel better about myself when I'm like, I'm being the most open and honest and authentic self. At the same time, somebody could come in and hurt me in a certain way, but I'm hoping to grow up to be like my dad, the way he comes across in films. As I'm getting older, I'm learning it's going to be very hard to knock me off my foundation, and it's taken a long time. But then one thing I will say that I really like is that the younger Indigenous people of today, I feel they have a stronger sense of self than we did when we were younger. I went through, as you saw in Untitled and Unlabeled, I went through an identity crisis. I didn't know where I fit into this earth, this world. But now I see younger kids, I'm like, I wish I was that age knowing what I know now, because who knows where I would be. But you know what, I'm really happy. We are all a culmination of our own life experiences. I wouldn't be who I am unless I went through the good and the bad things. One thing I learned is that you can prevent yourself from going through the bad things, but you're also gonna not succeed. You're gonna keep yourself from succeeding, and I'd like to think I'm hopeful. I'm somehow hopeful in the end. Aside from the end of the world scenario kind of coming towards me. Yeah.
Thanks.
And also one more thing. And one thing that I'd noticed is that we also live in this world where it's all about ideals and like what happiness is and what money is and what I've learned is that I've kind of tried to live my life not trying to grasp for those ideals. Yeah, I like those shiny little objects, but for the most part, I quantify how I'm doing by making things less worse. And it's not being pessimistic, it's being, I can quantify, I'm doing better than I was doing a year ago. And rather than saying, oh, I didn't get successful when I was in my early 20s, or, oh, I'm not gonna be able to go to film school until next year, sort of thing. I'm like, my path is what's there, and the creator and the universe will only put in front of me what I can handle. And I'm really, and as we say in our language, Nyawe means thank you, not literally thank you. It's being grateful for everything that you have.
I think one of the reasons this younger generation of Indigenous youth is more grounded is because they have filmmakers like you as role models, and to see the way you tell a story and to see your subject matter. And it's not like what you said you were looking at, a bunch of Hollywood films that didn't resonate in any way and didn't make you think that film was something for you. You've got a generation of kids now who can look to you and filmmakers like you and say, hey, this is a powerful way of expressing who we are. So, you've helped that younger generation get some of that self-confidence.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I'm hoping.
So I'm looking at our time clock clicking down. I think we're just about at the end of our program. Celine, did you have any last words for the folks?
I first wanted to thank Terry. That was a fantastic program. I enjoyed watching your films through again, and I learned so much more every time I watch them. It's the little nuances that you were pointing out, but even more so, just want to thank you for continuing those stories, because as a younger generation, I can promise that it's a lot easier to be what we can see, and these stories and the storytelling and passing on that knowledge and your own identities within that process really makes it easier for younger folks. And I'm not a young folk anymore, but makes it easier as we're going. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, Terry.
Yeah, thank you. I would like just to say one thing that in the chat, I wasn't even really able to read much, but if anybody wants to shoot me a message, you can go to my website at TornJerseyMedia.com. There I have a contact list, and then there as well you can see links to my other works and background information. So, and also I haven't done one for a while, but I should start doing a newsletter to keep everybody updated. So that would also be a great way if you want to keep up with what's going to happen with my next short film. Signing up for the newsletter would be great. And I want to thank everybody involved, the museum and the Indian Commission and Jean and Mervyn for inviting me to do this. It's just as exhilarating and learning for me as hopefully it was for you.
Oh, terrific. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great.
It adds so much depth to the films when we have the opportunity to hear you speak about them. So thank you. Mm-hmm. We'll do it again when you have your next film.
Yes.
Great.
We look forward to it.
Yeah.
I just linked your website on the chat for anybody who wants to click that before we end tonight's program. Terry, thank you so much. Jean, I'll pass the microphone over to you for any final remarks, and I'll also link the IIIR. I mess it up every single time, but I will link the website to the Institute for anybody who is interested in learning more and staying connected and continuing to be a part of this storytelling.
Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. Come back. We'll be here next month, second Wednesday.
June 9th. Thank you, everybody.